This is episode 343 of That Shakespeare Life. Just like the work of William Shakespeare, That Shakespeare Life is brought to you by our patrons. You can sign up to support the work we do here and get insider extras when you join us on Patreon. Sign up right now at patreon.com/thatshakespearelife.
Hi, I'm Mira Caffin-Terrace. I'm a senior lecturer in the Department of English at Ohio State. Another great method for studying the life of William Shakespeare includes listening to this. It's That Shakespeare Life with my friend Cassidy Cash.
They would have very sophisticated music, many melodies going at once to create harmony, and that's what polyphony is. And they would learn it by singing the psalmization notes. They would sing the ut, re, mi, fa, sol, la.
Welcome to That Shakespeare Life with Cassidy Cash. Cassidy believes that if you desire to successfully learn or perform Shakespeare's plays, then understanding the real life and history of William Shakespeare himself is a must. That Shakespeare Life is the podcast that helps you go beyond the curtain of some of Shakespeare's most iconic works and explore the world of early modern England as Shakespeare would have lived it, learning from the writers, historians, and performers who know it best. And now, here's Cassidy.
All four of Shakespeare's references to the word gamut show up in his play Taming of the Shrew, where the characters talk about learning and teaching the gamut. If you've ever heard the expression run the gamut or cover the gamut, these expressions are based on an 11th century understanding of the word gamut developed by the musician and monk named Guido d'Arezzo, who used the term to describe the whole range of notes. While there was no national standard of education in England for Shakespeare's lifetime, knowing about music, both how to play and scales like that of d'Arezzo, were considered a sign of nobility, which is the cultural perspective Shakespeare's applying when he puts the gamut in his play. Here today to share with us the history of the gamut, the 16th century musicians contemporary to Shakespeare that might have influenced the musical scenes of the play, as well as what exactly is meant by the phrase run the gamut, is our guest and professor at the O'Neill Hall of Music at the University of Notre Dame, Alexander Blachly. Alexander Blachly is the 1992 recipient of the Noah Greenberg Award given by the American Musicological Society to stimulate historically aware performances and the study of historical performing practices. Alexander has been active in early music as both performer and scholar since 1972, when he founded the New York vocal ensemble Pomerium, which he still directs. Mr. Blachly earned his postgraduate degrees in musicology from Columbia University and assumed the post of director of choral music at the University of Notre Dame in 1993. He has written articles on the German dialect of Gregorian chant, the hymns of Victoria, archaic polyphony in Dutch sources of the 16th century, the transition from mensura to tactus in the late 15th century, performance problems in Dufay's Nuper Rosarium Flores, and Tinctorius as a guide to tempo. He is currently writing a book on Pythagorean music of the Middle Ages and Renaissance. Hello, Alex. Welcome to That Shakespeare Life.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
At the University of Notre Dame, Alex teaches a class on music that includes, among many other topics, an explanation of the gamut, in which he defines a gamut as a hexachord. Alex, what are hexachords?
Well, the gamut is a series of hexachords first. I'll explain that in a minute. The hexachord is a 6-note scale. Hexachord means 6 strings. It's a 6-note scale. It's just like our modern major scales, working up from the bottom, 6 notes, and then that's the entire hexachord. Our method of psalmization that most people are familiar with comes from the names of the notes in the hexachord. They are ut, re, mi, fa, sol, and la. And so if you were to start on C on a keyboard and just go up 6 white notes, that would be a hexachord. All the hexachords are exactly alike in their structure. They consist of a whole step, another whole step, a half step, another whole step, and another whole step. In other words, there's only one half step in this 6-note scale. So when people are singing with hexachords, and that is what they did in the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, But they learned the hexachords, and they would apply these notes just like we do in modern psalmization. They would look at a piece of music written on a staff, and they would assign in their mind, or actually sing, the hexachord syllable. So the hexachords go back to Guido of Arezzo in the 11th century to around 1025 AD. He was a choir master at the Cathedral of Arezzo in Italy, and he devised this system. And many people are familiar with the psalmization, as I said, but he derived it from a hymn. And I think he wrote the melody himself, and the hymn goes like this. Ut reant laxis, resonare fibris, mira gestorum, famuli tuorum, salve polluti, labireatum, sancte Ioannis. And you might have noticed that each little phrase started with another note of the ascending scale, ut, re, mi, fa, sol, la. So that is what a hexachord is. They start initially just the one on C, but soon there was another one on F, or another one on G. And with these three hexachords, one could map out all of the notes that would be needed to sing the entire corpus of Gregorian chant. And that was the purpose of this initially. It was just to sing Gregorian chant.
The way that you're performing the music by saying the name of the note sounds very similar to what we have here in Appalachia called sacred harp singing or fa sol la singing, where you're singing the actual name of the note. I wonder if that's a precursor to that form of singing, because it sounds very similar.
Absolutely. Yeah, shape note singing is a version of singing with the hexachords. The thing about shape note singing is that the notes, whether they're a la or a fa or a mi, they have a different shape. In hexachord theory, the shape of the note is not important. It's just its place on the staff.
Well, you mentioned that they were based on hymns, or that this man originally derived it from a hymn. And I wonder what songs or hymns from Shakespeare's lifetime would represent the use of a gamut. Was it always Gregorian chants, or were there other songs that would have been applying a gamut?
Yeah, well, the gamut was used right up through the Renaissance and into the 17th century. So, yes, in Shakespeare's time, of someone learning to sing a song, if they hadn't heard it before, or learning to sing probably not so much a song, but polyphonic music, something more complicated, something used in church perhaps, or something used in a celebration, a formal celebration of the royalty or the aristocracy. They would have very sophisticated music, many melodies going at once to create harmony, and that's what polyphony is. And they would learn it by singing the psalmization notes. They would sing the ut, re, mi, fa, sol, la. And the advantage of that, as I'm sure you know, and most people who have done any form of psalmization know, is that you learn what the interval from ut to mi sounds like, or ut to fa. That's in your head. So anytime you hit an ut and you see that the next note is a fourth higher, it's going to be a fa, and you know what that sounds like. So it helps you sing something you don't know already and get the intervals correct, because you do know that ut to fa is a certain sound.
In the play Taming of the Shrew, Bianca talks about a gamut using letters like A, B, and C, but describing each letter as corresponding to re, mi, and other musical sounds, which strike our modern ears as very similar to the scale do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do. Are those scales similar, or is Bianca using some kind of universal music language here that we should maybe know before we analyze this scene?
No, it's just exactly the same thing. The only difference is that instead of ut, modern psalmization uses do, and they add a seventh note, ti, and now they have the entire 8-note scale. because you repeat do at the top. The hexachord theory didn't do that. It only went up 6 notes, and it may strike those of us who are familiar with modern psalmization as a strange way to go about it, but it is a very effective way, it turns out. And using these syllables from the hexachords, you can psalmize anything. And we know that even some of the royalty, some dukes liked to sing along with their choirs. And all these dukes in the Renaissance had their own establishment. They were incredibly wealthy and they had their own choirs. And they would often, if they were of a certain type, if they were a good singer, like Henry VIII was, or Hercules or Ercole Primo of Ferrara, he is known to have sung with his singers. He would sing along. And he particularly liked singing hexachord syllables. So he would like to psalmize. He would be sure he would get the right pitches that way. And he wasn't a professional singer, so this probably helped him not get lost and not sing wrong notes.
The use of the phrase gamut in this scene from Taming of the Shrew is sometimes attributed to a man named Thomas Morley. Who was Thomas Morley, and why would it make sense for him to have contributed musical knowledge to this scene?
Well, Thomas Morley was a composer, and he was also a theorist. And he wrote a book called A Plain and Easy Introduction to Music that was very, very popular when it was first published at the end of the 16th century. One would refer to Thomas Morley simply because he was a good summarization, or summary, I should say, of this medieval technique of singing the gamut. Like I said earlier, every musician was trained in this system. If you were a serious musician, if you were a choir boy in one of the cathedrals, and you grew up with the expectation that you would be a musician all your life and you would be a singer, and you would sing in cathedrals and in Renaissance chapel choirs, you learned this system. And everyone knew it like they knew the alphabet. So it made sense that Morley would explain this system to people who were not musicians. And that would be a very popular reference point for people in Shakespeare's England.
Well, we've talked about the phrase run the gamut of emotions. Does this relate to or come from the musical understanding of the word gamut as a scale?
It does, in the sense that the gamut itself, that word, comes from the way the hexachords were laid out on a grid or as a ladder. So you have, at the bottom, you have ut, the bottom of a hexachord. And that ut was the G, an octave and a fourth below middle C. Now they use letter names as well. So they would call notes by A, B, C, D, E, F, and G. But the bottom note, which was a G, for that they used a capital Greek gamma. And gamut comes from the fact that that gamma was an ut. It was the bottom of the hexachord. And gamut came to mean the entire series of hexachords and all of the notes that were in it. And that was 22 notes. So 20 new notes going up from G at the bottom, all the white notes of the keyboard, plus 2 B flats. That would give you enough half steps that you could sing any melody as long as it didn't modulate, as long as it didn't introduce new accidentals. It was called musica vera by Guido of Arezzo, who invented the system. It was true music, meaning it was the music that was capable of accommodating all of the music of Gregorian chant. Any other accidentals that were not included in the gambit, they called musica ficta or musica falsa. They didn't mean it was fictitious or that it was false, simply that it was not part of the gambit. It was not part of the system. However, gamut as a term does mean everything. When we run the gamut, we do everything. So it's all of the notes of the whole system of musica vera.
Is this something we can recreate on modern pianos? Did pianos in the 16th century have the same number of keys that we have today, or do we have to play it differently based on the way the instruments are made now?
The keyboard was exactly the same. They didn't have pianos yet, so they had organs and they had harpsichords They had clavichords. All these instruments had the same kind of keyboard, and it's just like the modern keyboard. The tuning system that they used was a little different. But in terms of creating a hexachord on a keyboard, it was exactly the same procedure that you would use today. You could start on middle C, as I said at the beginning, and play up six white notes on the keyboard, and that would be a hexachord. You could start on G and do the same thing, and that would be a hexachord. You could start on F and do almost the same thing. But in order to get that sequence of a hexachord of whole step, half step, whole step, whole step, if you start on F, then you have to introduce B flat in order to get that half step where it belongs. So that was the great advantage of having hexachords starting on different notes, that you could accommodate a note that was not one of the white notes of the keyboard.
With this kind of in-depth musical instruction that includes memorizing these scales and understanding the pitch, we've mentioned that definitely anyone who was seeking a career as a professional musician would have known this as well as they know the alphabet. But what about someone in an aristocratic family? Like, we're watching the character of Bianca be taught this in Taming of the Shrew, and she was the daughter of an aristocratic family. So was that part of a noble family's education of their children, was to include this kind of musical instruction?
I would say in Shakespeare's time, absolutely. In Shakespeare's time, it was considered de rigueur for anyone who was highly educated to not only know musical terminology, but also to be a dancer and to be able to dance the official court dances, the galliard, the pavane, the basse dance, perhaps even in the later stages of minuet. And there were some other dances as well. We're not always sure what the steps were like, but a lot of research has been done on it. There's a number of dance troupes now that specialize in early dance. And this is something that, yes, certainly every daughter and every son in a noble family would have learned this. And they would have learned musical terminology just the way they learned the alphabet. It would have been just as familiar to them.
When we're talking about teaching or playing the hexachord in our conversation today, you've mentioned a relationship to the phrase 6 strings, but we've also talked about a keyboard and how many notes up or down you would be playing to accomplish a hexachord. When someone like Bianca was looking to learn this form of musical knowledge, would it have been taught on something with strings or something on a keyboard? What would have been the instrument used to teach these skills to someone in the 16th century?
Well, I'm not even sure they would necessarily have used an instrument, but if they did, it would have been a viola da gamba. That was an aristocratic instrument. It was like the violin family, except the viola da gamba family had 6 strings instead of 4. It had frets like a guitar, and it had a slightly different quality of sound. So the viola da gamba was a popular aristocratic instrument starting from the time of Henry VIII. He introduced them to England, or a harpsichord, or the English version of a harpsichord, a virginal, which was a very similar instrument, but had a slightly different tone quality. Same keyboard, so that would be an instrument that could be used, or a house organ. A lot of aristocratic houses had their own chapels, they had their own organs. And some of the organs were actually house organs that were not even in chapels or churches. They were just used in a family room where music was made. And music for gambas, that is viola da gambas, and organ, it was a very popular combination in England, especially during Shakespeare's time.
Well, you've definitely shown us today that there's a great deal of history to explore about the history of the hexachord and the gamut and all of the details in this scene from Taming of the Shrew, where we're learning about musical scales and how they were both taught and how they were used. And we would love to learn more about this topic. From your research and just extensive knowledge of this subject, what are some of your favorite books or resources you can recommend we use to learn more?
That's a really good question, because when you've been living with this sort of terminology and using it as much as I do, or anyone who has a choir or sings this music as I do, you no longer really remember where you learned it. It's like, where did you learn the alphabet? It's a little hard to remember that. But I have written down 3 sources that would explain where you could go to find out more about these things. The earliest one, and they're all in English, the earliest one is by a wonderful scholar named Gustav Rees, who taught at NYU for many, many years. And he wrote 2 books, Music in the Middle Ages and Music in the Renaissance. Music in the Middle Ages dates from 1940. It was published by W. Norton and Company in New York. Gustav Rees, spelled Gustave, and then Rees is Reese. And there are 3 passages in this book where he talks about the gamut, pages 142 to 52, page 157, and page 254. More recently, we have a book by Alan Atlas called Renaissance Music, Music in Western Europe, 1400 to 1600. Also a Norton book published in 1998. And he has also 3 passages where he talks about the gamut, pages 33 to 35, page 403, and page 561. And then most recently, a book by Fabrice Fitch called Renaissance Polyphony is part of the Cambridge Introductions to Music series, Cambridge University Press, 2020, pages 49 to 54.
These are great resources, and we will link to these in the show notes for today's episode. And if you'd like to see some of Alexander's work on the gamut and hexachord in particular, including some primary documents that demonstrate some of the things he's talking about today, you'll enjoy his course website on this topic. So we'll place links to both these resources he's mentioned as well as the website in our show notes for today's episode. So stay tuned for the URL for where to find those. Alex, we ask everyone this next question here at That Shakespeare Life, and that's, what's the one book you would take with you on a deserted island? My friends in England tell me I'm supposed to allow you the complete works of Shakespeare and a copy of the Bible, so your choice would be in addition to those.
One book or one series? Well, my great friend Richard Teruskin, who was my colleague at Columbia University when I was a graduate student, wrote an incredible amount. He died a couple of years ago, unfortunately, but he wrote an incredible series of books called The Oxford History of Western Music. 5 huge volumes. And he wrote them all by himself. And if I were on a desert island, I had no other books, I think I would take this series because it's a lifetime of reading. And how he did this, I don't know. I knew him pretty well. I knew how he worked. And he was the hardest working person I ever met in my life. I thought he was going to wear himself out when he was a very young man. But fortunately, he lived well into his 70s. And he produced not just this book, but many other books. A book of essays called The Danger of Music, which is really very provocative. He wrote articles for the New York Times that were very provocative as well. And he wrote a book called Text and Deed, which were more essays. He's a wonderful writer. He's entertaining. He's interesting. He's very, very well informed. And he's provocative. So I would take that, I think, and I would have a lifetime of reading on my island.
You speak of a lifetime of reading. It sounds like a lifetime of work to accomplish as well. That's tremendous to have completed. That's a great selection, and not only a good choice, but a nice tribute to your friend as well. I think that's a good choice. So what's next for you? What are you working on now that you're excited about?
Well, I've been working on a book that I was calling Pythagorean Music of the Middle Ages and Renaissance. Initially, I was going to call it Hearing Heaven, as a tribute to my friend Christian Gaugier, who wrote 2 books, one on non-musical art, Pythagorean art from antiquity and the Middle Ages, and one on the same subjects in the Renaissance. And so, since she had called one of them Finding Heaven and the other one Measuring Heaven, I thought a third one called Hearing Heaven would be a nice tribute. But since then, I've decided I'm not going to call it that. I'm going to call it Hidden Numbers in Pythagorean Music of the Middle Ages and Renaissance. I think it's a little more direct, and it's a little bit more about what this book is really about. And it's about composers who have written music where some kind of numerical idea was the beginning point. And it affected everything about the way the piece was written. And there are 6 stages of this that I cover in the book. They start in the 13th century, and they go up to Shakespeare's time with music of Thomas Tallis. And they're fascinating pieces because they tend to be ambitious pieces. They tend to be important pieces, ceremonial pieces, and pieces where a composer is really testing what he is able to do once a mathematical idea has been set down that has to be followed. So I've been interested in this topic for practically my whole adult life. I've seen it in action in music that I performed with my performing group, Pomerium. And I decided some years ago that I would write a book about it. The book is now essentially finished. It's going to be published by Brepols, I think within a year or so. And it's kept me pretty occupied for about the last 10 years.
You could always call it hearing numbers to tie into the connection with meter and tempo. But regardless of what you call it, it sounds fascinating. And I know we'll look forward to seeing that come to fruition. Thank you so much, Alexander Blachly, for being here today and taking us through the history of the gamut, the hexachord, and helping us learn just a little bit more about music from Shakespeare's lifetime. This has been a fun conversation, and I appreciate you being here to share it with us.
Thank you very much.
As promised, the list of resources and recommendations we've been talking about today, along with more information about Alexander Blachly and his work into the gamut and the hexachords that we based our episode around today, are all found in the show notes for today's episode. You can find a complete list of these things and places where you can follow Alex's work at CassidyCash.com/episode 343. That's CassidyCash.com/EP343. If you'd like to see more in-depth history related to our show today, including some primary documents and some period illustrations that show you some of these instruments we talked about, like the harpsichord and the virginal, as well as that violin da gamba that we talked about, or viola da gamba that we talked about, where you can see the 6 strings. And if you really want to just dive in and get your hands on some of that more meatier history about our topic today, then you will really enjoy our detailed show notes. This is available for patrons of our show, and it expands right on the regular show notes page. Visit CassidyCash.com/episode 343 and look for the Patreon button. There you can log in if you're already a supporter of our show, or you can join us right there on the page, and all of these extras will expand immediately. Again, that URL is CassidyCash.com/episode 343. That Shakespeare Life is made possible by our patrons. You can support That Shakespeare Life and have a direct hand in the making of our show with sneak peeks at upcoming episodes and the opportunity to submit questions you'd like asked live on the air. Find out more and sign up today at patreon.com/thatshakespearelife. That Shakespeare Life is researched and produced by me, Cassidy Cash. Our audio engineer is Gary Mayholm. That's it for this week. Thank you for listening. I'm Cassidy Cash, and I hope you learned something new about the Bard. I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to That Shakespeare Life. As always, the best conversations happen after the episode over at CassidyCash.com. Become a part of a vibrant Shakespeare conversation by adding your voice over at the website. Until next time, remember, when you want to know William Shakespeare, you have to go behind the curtain and into That Shakespeare Life.